Hi there guys, got a video here today on the FX-M4, and what I'm going to be doing in today's video is fitting the quick tune system to the side of the rifle. Now along with the quick tune system I am also going to be fitting a hammer spring lock, which allows us to lock off the adjustment when we don't need to adjust it. I'll show you how this works very shortly, but don't worry, if you want to use the original FX part I will go through fitting that as well. With that said, before work begins, we need to make the rifle safe to work on by first cocking the rifle, removing the magazine or single shot loader if one has been fitted, then we can close the bolt and fire the rifle into a nice safe backstop. What that does is ensure that there's not a pellet loaded into the barrel and that we should be safe to continue. The next thing we're going to do is make a note of our current hammer spring setting. So if we take a look at the side of the rifle, our power wheel is on position number 16, and if we look at our hammer spring adjustment here, you can see that the line is aligned with position number 2. We're going to be making a quick note of that, as that will allow us to set the hammer spring roughly to where it is now. Right then, with that all out of the way, the next thing we can do is start work on the disassembly process, and to begin with we just need to remove the power wheel as well as the hammer spring shuttle. To begin with, we'll remove the power wheel by just using a 3mm Allen key to remove this bolt in the centre. And with that loose, we can gently pull the power wheel up, being nice and careful as there will be a couple of ball bearings and a couple of springs in this area here. Sometimes the balls can get stuck to the back of the power wheel if it's got a little bit of grease on it. With that said, we can then remove the springs and ball bearings by just using a small magnet. And there we have them there, so there's the 2 springs and 2 ball bearings. Up next, we're going to need to remove the grub screw from the centre of the hammer spring shuttle, and to do that we're just going to be using an L-shaped Allen key. Now this probably is the most tedious part of the whole disassembly process, so I'm just going to skip ahead to where I've got the grub screw out. And there we have it. So there's the grub screw removed. I will say when you get almost all the way out, you can use a ball-ended Allen key, coming in nice and close to the block at a shallow angle, get in the end there, then unscrew the grub screw. That makes the last 5 or so millimeters go much faster. But with that said, we come to probably the most critical part of the whole disassembly process, and that is removing this screw from the centre of the hammer spring body. Now this will be done up very tightly and with a bit of Loctite from the factory, so it is very important that you use a high quality new Allen key. And that's very important because you don't want to round this screw out, otherwise you're going to have to drill it out. But with that said, we're going to insert our Allen key into the end there, then I'm just going to tap it into position. With that done, I'm going to unscrew this nice and carefully. I will say I've already broken the Loctite on this particular screw, so it does come out fairly easily for me. But there we have it, there's the screw on the end of the Allen key there. If your screw is particularly difficult to remove, what you may have to do is get yourself a soldering iron and put that onto the end of the screw to break the Loctite. What sometimes happens in the assembly process is that the Loctite works its way up onto the back of the head and glues the bolt into the hammer spring adjuster. Normally you don't need heat to remove the bolt as long as you're using a good quality Allen key, but just keep that in mind if your bolt feels incredibly tight. With that done, we can unhook the original hammer spring shuttle, which is just that piece there. If you're reusing this component, I highly recommend just going through the threads here and just removing the old Loctite. The older grub screws are Loctited in place to make the adjustment not wander as you're shooting the rifle, so it's a little bit of anti-vibration Loctite. Right then, with the old hammer spring adjuster system removed, what I've gone ahead and done is just laid out the components that you get in the quick tune kit. Now this quick tune kit here was purchased by myself from Bagnall and Kirkwood. In the very near future I am going to be sending Bagnall and Kirkwood some hammer spring locks, so if you're interested in getting the entire kit you can do that from Bagnall and Kirkwood. If you just want the lock, I do supply the lock and a fitting kit on my eBay store, which I'll link in the description below, and I'll also put a link for the quick tune system in the description up below again. With that said, we're going to be putting the original hammer spring adjuster to one side, as I'm going to be fitting the new locking one as well as the original screw. In the locks that I sell, I am going to be including a replacement screw, as it's very likely that you will damage or mark up the original one when you go to remove it, so I just included a new one. In the kit you also get a spring and a ball. What this does is put increments in the hammer spring adjuster so that as you turn it, it sort of clicks through the adjustments. Now I'm not going to be fitting that on my particular rifle, as I've found over time that the ball bearing wears against the hammer spring adjuster and it just makes it look a little scruffy, so I'm not going to be fitting that to my rifle. The last thing I'll mention is that in the locking kit you do also get 3 different grub screws to lock off the hammer spring adjustment. I'll get to their purpose and what each of them does when we actually fit the kit. So for now, the only thing we need to do before we can get this fitted is fit the wheel to the shaft. So these 2 pieces together. What we need to do is line and then we can get that locked into position with this small grub screw here. This is done up with a 1.3mm Allen key, just like that. So there we have our adjustment wheel fixed onto the shaft. With that done, we can start getting our components fixed into the side of the rifle. So the first thing we're going to do is take our adjustment shuttle, whether that be the locking one or the original one, and we're going to be adding the securing bolt to the middle. Just pushing that into place, and using a 2mm Allen key just to make sure it's seated. With that done, we're going to be taking our threaded rod, putting that through the back there, although we're not going to be pushing it through all the way just yet. We just need to get it started in the body. Now, at this point I will mention, if you're fitting the detent to your rifle, you can put the spring and the ball bearing in that hole there. So you'd put the spring in first, then cap it off using the ball bearing. Now I've found it much easier to install that with just a little bit of grease. The grease just keeps all the components together and stops them rolling out. Again, I'm not going to be fitting it to this rifle, but that does need to go on before we fit the quick tune system. So the next thing we'll do is drop that into position and then get our securing screw done up using a 2mm Allen key. As you do that up, just make sure that the shaft itself isn't resting on the outside edge of the block, otherwise as you do this screw up it will bend the shaft. The other thing that I'll mention is that if you were worried about this screw coming loose under normal use, what you could do is put a small amount of blue Loctite on the screw threads just to stop it from vibrating loose. However, as this is a sub 12-pound rifle, I've not found it to come loose of its own accord. But with that said, we're going to be screwing the adjuster in. And what we're looking for is so that the grub screw is just not touching that center pivot point there. So it should look something like that. The next thing we're going to be doing is taking this long spring, so that long spring there, and using a set of tweezers. What we need to do is fit it into the shaft itself, so the shaft does have a hole running through it. We're going to be getting the spring lined up with a hole, just pushing it into position like so. With that done, we can now cap that off with this piece here. So again, we're just going to be using our tweezers, lining the spring with a hole, and then getting that pushed into position. With that hooked into position, the next thing we're going to do is take our dog-pointed grub screw, so that looks something like that, and then we're going to be installing that in the top of the block. So if I just tip the gun up nicely, you can see that that threaded hole right in the middle of the screen there is where we need to install this grub screw. It is a little tricky to get started, so just go nice and slow. And I'm going to be getting that done up nice and tightly with a ball-ended Allen key. But there we have the grub screw installed. At this point we should be able to spin the power adjuster nice and freely, so that's working as it should. And then what we can do is just back out the adjustment so that we have a small gap between the threaded rod and that pivot point there. At that point we can start bringing over our power wheel components, so starting off with the two springs, topping those off with just a touch of lithium grease. Then we can drop the ball bearings over the holes. Then we can bring over our power wheel once again and just add a very small amount of lithium grease to this back side here, just wiping off the excess with our fingers. With that done, we can get that dropped into position. Then we can secure that using the small bolt. Now this bolt doesn't need to be done up mega tight, we just need to get it so that it's snugged. Right then, and there we have the unit fitted, all ready to go. The only bit of troubleshooting advice I would give you is that if your power wheel is set to anything other than minimum and you wind the adjustment all the way out, when you go to try and get the maximum setting, the wheel itself may bind. That's just because this wheel here is hitting with this part of the adjuster. So all you need to do is wind it down a couple, put some hammer spring adjustment on there, then set the power wheel to maximum once again. With that done, the next thing we need, apart from that, to fit the quick tune system, it's very easy. The only sort of tricky part about it is removing the original screw in the side of the block, but once you get that out, fitting the unit and removing it is fairly simple. With that said, the next thing we need to do is set our power. So if we look on the top of the lock block there, you can see that we've got a laser engraved notch that's currently pointing to about 1.5 on the hammer spring setting. What we can do is just wind a bit of adjustment on there until we reach 2.5, which it was before we removed the original unit. I will say we do have a notch on both sides so that you can reference both sides of the markings on the block. With that done, the last thing we would need to do is check the rifle over the chronograph to make sure that we're getting the power that we want. Then we can lock off the adjustment using one of 3 grub screws. So the first grub screw is a standard flat pointed grub screw. So it has a flat end on one end, then it has a 1.5 hex broached into the end. That's the easiest and one of the most secure ways of locking off the adjustment. It just requires a 1.5mm Allen key. You can make your adjustments, then lock it off once again. The only downside of using this particular grub screw is that if you tighten it onto the threads of the threaded rod, it will damage them slightly. Although I will say I've not found that to be a problem if you're adjusting in one particular area. If you're going all the way from minimum to all the way to maximum over and over again, you may find that to cause a problem. But if you're just adjusting between sort of 2 and 3 or 3 and 4, I've not found it to be an issue. The second way of locking it off is using the silver grub screw. So this silver grub screw is very similar to the first one in that it has a flat bottom. However, it's silver and it has a T6 broached into the end there. So instead of using a 1.5mm Allen key, you can just use a T6 Torx bit to loosen the lock and then tighten it once again. So the first 2 grub screws lock off the adjustment very securely. The only thing they do is slightly damage the threads if you tighten them onto the threads. The last grub screw that I include in the kit is a nylon tipped one. So this has a soft tip on the end of the grub screw designed specifically not to damage the threads. So this is the one I use on my rifle. The only downside to the nylon tipped one is that the nylon will deform over time. So there we have it. There's the 3 choices for the grub screw in the end there. If you're the type of person that doesn't want to adjust your rifle, you just want to set it and forget it, I would highly recommend using one of these 2 grub screws. If you're the type of person to do a bit of tuning, so you've got a couple of barrels and want the ability to adjust the hammer spring nice and quickly, I would recommend using the nylon tipped one, although be aware that you may need to replace the nylon tipped grub screw after a bit of use. But there we have it. There's the quick tune system as well as the lock fitted, and there we have just a side by side with the original part. So to adjust the hammer spring on the original rifle, all you would need is a 1.5mm Allen key to adjust the grub screw in the side there. On our new system, you still need the exact same 1.5mm Allen key to loosen the lock. Then you can adjust the hammer spring just by spinning the wheel with your hand. So both systems need the exact same tool to operate. With that said, the only other thing that I'll mention is that with the adjustment locked off, you can still operate the power wheel. So if you want to experiment with a lower pellet speed, you can set it to 16. Say we've got the feet per second set at 790. Then you can just adjust the power wheel at the bottom there and experiment with different pellet speeds. But I just wanted to make you aware that that should work with the lock locked off. Right then, and there we have it. That's the quick tune system as well as the lock fitted to the M4. So I'll just get you a real quick look over the M4 now. It's looking rather nice. I did manage to get the muzzle brake and the moderator core anodized, so it's black matching the rest of the rifle. With that all said and done though, that's pretty much going to do it for this particular video. Thank you very much for watching. I hope it's been interesting or useful, and I'll see you in the next one.